Hello and welcome. Today's conversation is with Professor Laura Cram, who has a unique career profile that added great colour to our discussion on inner body awareness. Not only does Laura guide people through their inner sense of interception through her role as a yoga teacher, but she also draws upon the neurobiology of interception in her work as Professor of European Politics at Edinburgh University. Laura is also a director of NRLabs Neuropolitics research. So a theme that stood out to me in this interview was that of discernment. A message that often is emphasised in the field of body awareness work is how important it is to be able to sense what's going on inside our bodies. For sure, that's important. But how often do we try to determine whether the cause we've attributed to the way that we feel is right or wrong? And if our judgment is wrong, what do we do to correct it? So I'll leave you with the full interview where Laura touches on many more fascinating insights, and please remember to subscribe to the Inner Sense channel for more information about the science of interception and tips for understanding your inner world. Thank you very much. Hi Laura, thanks for joining me. I'm really excited to kind of speak to you today about interception and find out a little bit about your fascinating career background, because as I believe you still work in the field of politics. So maybe we could start by hearing a bit about your background and your interest in yoga and how you arrived at living in Edinburgh, teaching yoga and studying or working in the field of politics.
Okay. Thanks very much for having me, Ian, and I'm really happy to contribute to all these interesting contributions you have on your channel. I'm a bit of an odd fish, I guess. My background is I'm a professor at Edinburgh University. I'm a professor of European politics, but I'm also the director of the Neuropolitics research lab at Edinburgh University. And they were very generous when I moved to Edinburgh and gave me half of my time to retrain in human cognitive neuropsychology and in the practice of neuroimaging, so that I could explore some of the things that were really intriguing me in my studies on identity and emotions and politics, and particularly the things that motivate us to act, and whether or not we are driven by emotional identity links, or whether or not actually identity could be something that was quite hard-headed and rational and instrumental. And one of the ways I thought we could maybe get at that was by exploring it through the neurobiology approach. And so that's how I started the Neuropolitics Research Lab, and that is really the beginning of the story of how I got the opportunity to work with fabulous people around the world on interception and embodied cognition, and to begin to see how all of that fed into my work, both in my academic work at the university, but also, as we're going to talk about today, my yoga practice and my practice as a yoga teacher.
Just to sort of make sure I understood that clearly, so you were interested in whether decisions are driven by our emotional factors or our identity. Those two different things. Can you say a little bit about what? So sort of said a hard kind of rational identity. Is that kind of the sort of cognitive picture we have of who we are, maybe our job title or our role, versus when you say emotional, is that more kind of physiologically driven, sort of some of the ingredients of emotion coming from the body, or what are the two different, how do you define those two different things that might be driving the decision?
Okay, so I guess I would probably go even maybe a step further back than that, and where I came to this was trying to understand the role that identity played in shaping our decisions, and to get to that point, I had to disentangle the understandings of identity. And in the identity literature in political science, there tends to be a real split between those who present identity as something very, in that sense, when we say emotional, sentimental, maybe something that we're almost born with, it's unconscious to us, it's a really fundamental aspect of our being, and that is something that we don't give up easily and maybe don't shift easily. But there's a whole other strand in that literature that says, actually, we will shift our identities if we think that the level or the structure or the organization that we're operating within isn't really serving us. And we do, and we have examples of us shifting our identities. And my background is in looking at things like the European Union, so we can see where we get growth and movement in identities. We do shift, and do shift differentially in different countries. So the other side was to say, well, actually, sometimes it's quite an instrumental thing. Sometimes we weigh up the costs and benefits of how we make these decisions. And I guess I saw that as a bit of a false dichotomy, and was really interested in why it's sometimes extremely rational to be emotional. So to tap into some of the physiological responses that we have, perhaps some of the unconscious responses that might be very, very important in guiding our rational decisions. And even from the point of knowing that, to be safe as a baby, we are required to get people to like us, look after us, take care of us, then it's incredibly rational to inspire emotional responses in others. And so, yeah, that's the background to how I came to looking at that as a political scientist.
Wow. So there may be some, if it's from birth, there may be some kind of almost hardwired, reflexive sort of things that we kind of hack each other for our identity. Is that what you're saying? For if a baby is going to influence a caregiver?
Yeah, and I mean, some people believe that it is that we are hardwired and we're born with a social brain. And others, there's some really good literature that looks at it much more as something that's constructed, something that we develop as babies, that in our relationship with our primary caregiver, then we develop that relationship and the ability to generate the responses that we require to be taken care of. But either way, whether or not we're hardwired with it or whether it's something that we develop as part of our social development, then it's absolutely intrinsic to us and our survival and our relationship with others.
I'm really torn now whether to keep asking about your sort of work in politics or to turn towards yoga and interception. So maybe we'll talk, I'm thinking we'll dip into yoga for a while and then maybe come full circle and see what that means for interpersonal relationships. So with yoga, it was actually my colleague Joe who manages social media for us, and he spotted your account, Interception Yoga, and my ears pricked up, and I thought, this is the first person who has actually kind of branded yoga as Interception Yoga, which is great. How do you use interception within the yoga practice? Then having practiced yoga myself, I'm aware that it's often part of many of these practices, but how do you work with it?
Yeah. So I guess my starting point is that when I began my yoga teaching offering, part of what I was thinking about is, what is it that I get out of this, or that I understand out of this, that is something that I would want to share with other people. And I think rather than feeling like I'm bringing the idea of interception to yoga, I feel very much that yoga is about interception, and that in many ways, and as with so many of the things that we found out with these ancient practices like yoga, that the science is catching up with many of the practices that have long been known to have an impact on emotional regulation, have powerful effects on anxiety and stress regulation. And so for me, it was much more thinking, what is it that I know about in my workplace and in my academic life that speaks to what I've also been learning in my yoga training, and that I experience myself in my yoga training, and that I think that actually teasing out might help other people through the yoga practice. So I think there's been a real mix in yoga. So for a period, I think almost something that put people off yoga was the sense of this deeper practice that emerged, and almost this like wariness. Was it a religious practice? Was it something cultish? So my grandmother was an Iyengar yoga teacher, and she trained in the 1970s and 80s, and it was considered really quite unusual. Why would this woman be leaving her family and the dog and heading off to India to train with Mr. Iyengar? So I'm familiar with it from that side. And I would say for myself, that probably was one of the things that early on put me off. Things like chanting, I couldn't get on board with it. I was much more of a sports type. And if I did do yoga was my secondary exercise. It was to do my stretches, to do my relaxation. I didn't really get what yoga as a technology. And that's really, I suppose, how I think about it now. I didn't really get how it worked. But when I was doing my deeper training, and obviously you don't come to do that training until you've begun to get that it does something else for you. But what really fascinated me again and again was the way that some of the practices that have been in existence for so long were finding, if you like, validation in the neuroscientific literature, in the really thriving emergent interception psychology literature. And yeah, so it was really the eureka moment for myself that was, hey, this is what I'm doing at work, and this is what I'm doing in my yoga practice. And I think actually explaining that a little to people can help them to key in a little to some of the deeper aspects of the yoga practice.
Yes, and it's so odd, isn't it, how we've compartmentalized all these different practices and traditions. Even as you were talking then, and you mentioned chanting, I was thinking how something as simple as singing in the shower, or people partying together, or going to a disco. It's all basically, we're influencing our physiology by breathing and moving with a rhythm. And we take some of those things as normal, but then this idea of yoga, and when I first went to yoga, I felt like I was doing something a little bit naughty. Would my parents approve for me?
It was quite unusual. And then, of course, I think it shifted to the other direction, where it became very heavily about the asana and about the postures and about achieving the fanciest posture. And, don't get me wrong, I'm always going to want to try and see what shapes I can find in my yoga practice. But that can lose also the element of the technology that I think is really important. And it's that combination of the techniques that we know and love that brings us to a different place in the yoga practice. And I think understanding that element of the connection is the bit that really intrigues me. And I think it's probably the bit that's like my characteristic across learning, and the way that I've traversed across the disciplines is very similar to the way that I see the yogic practice. It's pulling together the scientific knowledge, the ancient practices, the physical practices, and actually the experience of it that gives you that understanding of interception as not even just the connection between brain and body, but as almost a seamless weft and weave, like a fabric that's being woven together. And I find that helps people a little bit to get over. So it's not just, what's happening in my brain, and can I still my brain and still my mind while I'm doing something in my body? It's actually the process of doing both together that allows those two to happen. And I really love that understanding of I was just using the Damasio quote from his latest book on the way that our nervous system is attached to our naked interior. So there's just no dissociation between the two. They are entangled with one another. And yeah, that kind of story, I think, in some ways helps people to understand how their movement, how their breath, how their humming or chanting can really shift the way that they go about thinking about things, and then the way that they actually behave.
So much I could, so many little things I could we could go down lots of different rabbit holes with this. So that's really, really great stuff. And we've taken some of the phrases from, I'm sure you've heard of Lisa Feldman Barrett and her concept of body budgeting, which I think is so good, because it's, this idea of budgeting includes planning in the future, and the idea of a body budgeting means that it's all about our resources and energy levels. So that gives people something very practical to link the brain and the nervous system to looking after, our overall health and energy levels and well-being, which is what everyone wants, I think, out of life, is to be able to function well and to, manage sounds very sort of formal, but to have a successful energy balance over time. I think that's what we're all after at the end of the day.
And I think that actually that body budgeting approach is really, really helpful. I use it in my workshops as well, because I think it helps people to understand that homeostasis, if you take it as an abstract concept, can just be a bit meaningless. But having something where people can understand that constant process of prediction in the brain, the constant creating of kind of as if hypotheses, always trying to get you on track. That's really, really helpful. And also, so the body budgeting I also really find very useful the notion of somatic markers. So the notion that we associate particular physiological states with particular emotions, and that can affect the way that we make decisions. But more importantly, from my perspective, and the thing that I really like to talk about with people, are somatic errors and the way that we can get it wrong. And I think that's really important, because I'm seeing a huge growth in the kind of interception literature, and let's be aware of our bodies. And that's really great. And I think tuning into our bodies is so important. But also knowing that how we interpret those messages from our bodies can be fundamentally wrong, and that can have really serious effects. That, for me, if there's anything that I want to do in my classes and in my workshops, it's to get people to detect and become, I love when people are talking about the difference between being interoceptively aware, interoceptively sensitive, and interoceptively accurate. And we're not always accurate.
That's right. And that, without wanting to use too much jargon, this idea of Bayesian modeling and error correction and prediction, error minimization, as the way that the nervous system operates. So I wonder if one question coming up here is, when you're working with, maybe you could explain like a typical new client you're working with. My experience is that, to jump straight, for some people, not all of them, but for some people, jumping straight into this idea of, I need to identify an interoceptive error or a cognitive error and correct that straight away, that would be just far too much of a leap. It's almost like we have to maybe just start with noticing what's going on in the body, and then gradually get a handle on the body's curious little ways. How do you do that in the context of a yoga class then, for someone who's maybe a newcomer?
Yeah, so I really agree with that. To suddenly launch into the background to it would just be totally off-putting. And my work varies dramatically according to whether I'm in a class situation, a specific workshop that might be tackling a particular topic, or if you were working one-to-one with persons. So you can have a bit of a different approach, and also it would depend if people already knew what you were offering, because I think that can help a little bit. But yeah, for me, it's very much the language of tuning in. So having a sense of what it means to tune into your body, to not, again, we talk very much about that language of non-judgment, not necessarily trying to shift something, just trying to see what happens in these situations. And of course, that really is what a yoga practice is all about. When you find yourself in a position, it's not about, can I get into this position? Can I stretch further? How do I stretch further? But how do I feel about the fact that this is where I am right now? That can be really, really challenging. Sometimes, in somebody like me, that's a real challenge. So as an athlete, I'm also a rower. I'm a cold water swimmer. I like to challenge myself. And in a yoga class, I have to really notice that I'm still doing it and just go, what do you actually need to reach a little further today? Or could you just get to where you're going, get to the point where you're comfortable, get to the point where you feel like you're in a better place? But what does that mean? And that, I guess, is what I want to have in my classes, is for people to recognize just what they're doing, what their patterns are, whether they always need to have the same pattern, whether they can, and what would it feel like to change it? So I do some work on, what are the specific sensations and such like, but often it's more about what is your state of being, rather than just specifically, am I hot here? Am I cold here? Am I strong or am I tight?
Your state of being. And do you mind now if we dive back to the politics? Because that's
cool.
that idea of, because I'm very curious on what drives us as humans, and and if these questions of what we want to become with our identity and our lives, and even what we want. And what you just said there about an athlete who's kind of comfortable with maybe pushing themselves into discomfort, but then where do we stop with that? What I really liked was that you were I got this hint that you were checking in with how much you're pushing yourself, or how much discomfort, rather than just blindly going for the next, the next hit of, or the next rush of challenge. So this may not be related to your specific topic of EU and politics, but can you maybe comment on, when it comes to decision making in organizations or within politics, how something like interception may help with group dynamics? Is that too much of a big question?
No, that's really relevant. My background actually was studying how the European Commission as a bureaucracy functioned, and as an organization. I think there are really, really interesting aspects of understanding how our physiological responses relate to our process of decision making, but also to our relationships with other people. So we know a lot. My colleagues at Aarhus work, for example, in the Interacting Mind Centre, about how we, if you like, co-regulate with others in our decision-making processes, how different contextual factors can affect that. And I think one of the things we're learning from things like interception is not only what's happening internally within our bodies, but that how what's happening internally for us is being affected by the context within which we find ourselves. And when you're thinking about a decision context within institutional structures, you're remembering that that's ramped up and multiplied by all of the other characters, personalities, bodies, and by the physical space. For example, some of the work that we do looks at things like implicit triggers. So if there are particular flags or colours in a space, that actually affects our physiological responses, and often at a level that's unconscious to us. So becoming more aware of anything in our space that affects our decisions is really helpful to an organisation. Being aware of how different interpersonal dynamics, about how different physical spaces, about different environmental and contextual factors. If people come rushing into the meeting and they've just rushed out of the previous meeting and they're already got their hearts racing and their heads spinning, how much are we expecting a really calm and collected decision process to take place? So these are all features that are increasingly, I think, emerging in the decision-making literature, and we're seeing a whole growth There's a fabulous news centre in London on the politics of emotions that's run by Manas Sahiris. There's a hot politics lab. And so lots of people who are looking at how our neurobiology, how our physiology, how our emotional states are affecting the way that we take decisions. And I think that will be a big step forward in decision science. We were involved last year in a project with the European Commission where we produced a report that was a multidisciplinary report on our political natures. And that was all about the European Commission trying to understand a bit more about how we come to decisions and how all these factors affect decisions so that they could inform their policymakers about making better decisions. So yeah, it's a really, really exciting field with lots of exciting people involved in it.
I wasn't aware that there was so much research being done around decision making in politics. That's great news. And those two sort of things you mentioned there, the implicit cues or triggers. So I'm just, when you said about flags, I was just imagining walking into a room with lots of, symbols which represent, maybe I need to be on my best behavior, or I need to take all these things into account. And I'm trying to relate that back to my own life and thinking, if I go to a family member's house where, I need to be, everything's prim and proper, and the what's at stake if I step out of line compared to someone else's house where, things are a bit more relaxed, maybe. Exactly. What that's doing to my physiology. And then how are you anticipating that before you even go in? Yeah, the drive. How many times have you found yourself back in that childhood state? You haven't even stepped through the door. Yes, yeah. Oh, yeah, it happens now. Even to this day, I notice the journey to somewhere is when physiology starts to change. The other thing you mentioned is the what's happened before. The minutes or hours before a meeting. So the state that we arrive in. I'm really fascinated by this idea that our physiology constrains our thinking. I think our body constrains. I think a guy called John Vervaeke. I don't know if you've come across him. So I remember him sort of talking about this, and the more I think about that, the more I feel it's absolutely true. And a sports person like you will know, someone who likes being physically active, that after a workout, your mental functions are completely different to if you've just sat down after a roast dinner and got a food coma coming on. And so to bring that into the field of politics and decision making and this idea of threat or safety is really, I think it could be potentially see great leaps forward for politics. Do you think? It is very exciting, and funnily enough, that makes me want to flip right back to the yoga classes, which I think that's the same story of co-regulation. Mm-hmm. So when you come flying into the room, all in that state, and everybody else is coming in that agitated state, that's part of what we're also seeing. If you want to set up for a session with somebody, and I'm sure if you're working with a client, you want to have a peaceful state before you start. I know that my preferred thing is to get in early, to be able to do some of my own chanting, to really get into the state so that my voice, my breath, and in some of my classes, I'll use touch as well. But that in that process of co-regulation, that what I'm giving is not all the stress of my previous day, but that actually is, we often talk about holding space, and sometimes it gets thrown about a bit as a phrase, oh, you're welcome, I'm holding the space. But actually, I do think that's a fundamental part of that process of creating a sense of a safe space. And that's not just me saying it's a safe space, it actually has to come from my physicality, my emotional state that I can project into the space. And I think we are quite aware when somebody's not in that place and they're teaching you on a day, and we've all been there. I've taught in universities for 30 years, and there's days when your class has really connected, and days when you just couldn't quite get that sense of working together. So I do think, again, that co-regulation of our bodies, the being aware of how our own physical state
can shape the way that we project information and we share information, and then share an environment is really fundamental. And that's the same from the politics through to the yoga.
I just think it's wonderful that we've got people like you researching this for the sake of humanity at the political level, but also able to walk the talk and to have your own practice and to teach something at more community level with yoga. That's quite unique, I believe.
It's definitely unusual. I think that's the nature of these curious, passionate learners is that we can always find another place to grow and learn. And at least it means you're sharing the learning journey with everybody else. It keeps you from ever being just like an expert on something because you're always learning with others. It's all new. And I think that's the thing, again, you'll know that from working on interception, that the thing that probably gives you most humility in any of this field is knowing that anything that anybody's talking about the brain is something we're learning every day. Mm-hmm. And that what we've learned yesterday might not be exactly right tomorrow, because people are finding out so much more with the technologies, with the theories, with the computational science behind it. So I think it always keeps us on our toes, and as long as it's fresh for us, then it's much easier to deliver to somebody else that you are really genuinely sharing the learning journey rather than passing on expertise.
What sort of advice would you give to people who haven't really heard so much about interception, maybe the science of interception, but they want to start talking about their inner world and their feelings? How do you begin with someone who's not familiar with it, and how do we start verbalizing how we feel inside?
Yeah, I think that's quite interesting. I quite like some of the really traditional techniques from people like Gendlin on the felt sense. And really allowing people perhaps not to just go looking for feelings and names, but perhaps to see what they associate with feelings. So if you're thinking about a happy state, or you're thinking about a mildly stressful state, what then is happening in your body? And I think sometimes that can be helpful. I also really like some of the Hakomi provocations, which are what would it feel like if you just weren't stressed? And what would that actually feel like in your body? And I'm a massive fan of props. You can't see here, but I've got lots of like weighted bits that form, well, maybe I can reach them, like bits that form blankets, weighted pads and weighted bean bags and bolsters. And I really encourage people to actually seek out what it feels like to be supported, or what it feels like to be grounded. And if people are doing it online, I sometimes have them with like bags of rice in cloth sacks. So they've got these weights, something that they can use to actually almost emulate what it would be like to be held, to be supported, to find something. But it can be quite nice to do it yourself. I mean, I am actually a fan of appropriate touch and consensual touch. And there's really good evidence from interception that it has quite important effects on coregulation and on the inhibition of anxieties. But to be able to do that or to replicate that for yourself is also really good, because I may be able to find an appropriate weight or compression that allows you to release a little bit more. But what's much more useful for you is to be able to replicate that for yourself when you get home and you're just thinking, oh, feeling really stressed. How do I find this place of being supported? So I use a lot of props.
Right, that's really good. I like that you're kind of you're wanting to empower people or give them the tools to be able to evoke a sense of safety, or starting off with props it's a position, isn't it? It's finding a position that will lead to a release or a relaxation response. But from what I also hear you hinting at is that asking people the question, what does safety feel like? So eventually we can evoke a kind of physiological response of safety at will when we most need it. And maybe our background level of safety will be, the set point for that will be higher over time if we practice.
I also like them to explore a little bit the idea that, sometimes if you've really associated all that tension in your stomach, say the butterfly, but with a really stressful situation, and you might not even be aware of what the situation is, but another time, sometimes it's just your stomach's upset. Mm-hmm. Or sometimes just you had too much to drink last night and your body's really working hard. Your body budget is in deficit, but it's not for the reason that your brain might think. And I think that's really empowering. So I guess finding tools that empower people to explore that a little bit themselves, and just with them very safe. And I do think that kind of titration thing is important, because these can sound very minor, using your bean bags, using your weighty pads, but actually it can be quite profound, because if you do touch on something for yourself that really does make you feel held, that release can be quite powerful if you've not felt held, if you've felt really tense and that you've always had to hold on to yourself and hold yourself together. So I think it's a kind of proceed with caution. That's
yes, yeah, opening cans of worms, if there's no support around to deal with the consequences
and especially if you're in a class or workshop environment, you're not in an individual therapeutic context, and people need to have support to do that. But.
Yeah, and this is another question that's just popped up. Do you have any thoughts on, this maybe a tension between the ability to self-regulate and co-regulate? So, at one extreme, you can say, okay, I'm a master at self-regulation. I can just, go and live in a cave and I don't need other humans for the rest of my life. But then, and that potentially that could lead to someone, being aloof in social situations, or at least giving the impression of being aloof, versus, co-regulation, which can help maybe during conflict or decision making. Do you have any, thoughts on how to gauge the ideal amount of self-regulation and co-regulation?
Yeah, that's really interesting. So obviously we live in communities, and for the most part, short of the person who manages to go and live in the cave, which of course interesting is kind of one of the highest, I don't want to say aspirations, but the notion within the yogic philosophy that you would finally become relieved of any of your demands from the external material world and could. But that's very, very rare and unusual. So I guess, what you want is a balance where you are not dependent on others to regulate yourself. So you have an ability to regulate, but I guess you would want an ability to function alongside others. So I suppose ideally, if we could both regulate ourselves and then work together, but not require one another for regulation. But that, I have to say, that's not my expertise in that sense. Right. But very interesting to toy with and think about. And certainly, we know that social connection is so fundamental to our general sense of well-being, and like all the studies on loneliness and the social neuroscience of loneliness are devastating. I can definitely see that we want to find ways to be able to connect, and I can understand that if you are entirely able to co-regulate, you might seem like you just don't need others. But I guess my hunch from a sort of also from a yogic perspective is that ideally we want to be able to find the resources within ourselves to regulate, and then to be able to coexist with others rather than to rely on others for our own regulation.
Coexist, and when it comes to going back to your work in politics, to cooperate, I guess. Now that we're in a globalization has happened.
Yeah, there's a great actually that sort of in international relations theories, there's a great image that's often used about the difference between having a coalition where you might be both like a couple of billiard balls and you can sit beside each other on the table, but you don't enmesh, if you like. And the difference between that and actually becoming much, much more interdependent, where you become like a web of connections. And I guess it's kind of finding a balance between that, where you can work with people but still be able to withdraw and function. But what most of us recognize is that in that process, we don't just withdraw and be exactly the same. We withdraw and we ourselves are somewhat altered. Yeah, that's quite interesting.
That is interesting. I'm aware of the time. Is there anything else, any other points you'd like to get across?
I don't think so. I think you've probably covered most of it. I hope my sort of the politics stuff isn't too weird for your audience. It's such an unusual background.
I just see politics as, as above, so below kind of thing. We've got into politics at the family level, friends level, haven't we? That's, with a small p, and, it's basically how humans relate to each other.
Absolutely. Yeah. And I mean, for me, that's why the connection isn't as bizarre as it might be, but but it is. The only thing that but it's probably going too far for that anyway, that I find particularly interesting in interoception in terms of the yogic thing is the way it relates to the koshas and the idea of the discernment.
The koshas I'm thinking of is they're like the different bodies. So we've got the different like layers, like Russian dolls.
Yeah, so they have this notion that you've got like your physical, your anatomical sheath, your energetic sheath, and then there's the kind of mind bit. But just below that in the koshas, and for me, it's really fascinating. They have a sheath it's often called the wisdom sheath, but it's considered to be about discernment. And I think that's what we're looking at in the interoception part. It gets stuck a lot of the times. So it's becoming a bit of a thing in the yogic field and to talk about interoception, but very often it's kind of stuck at this has got to do with your inner body and the mind-body relationship. But actually, I think the most exciting bit is that discernment aspect. The part of us that seeks to tune in and discern what these relationships are between the mind and body and what's happening in the mind, rather than us just thinking, oh yeah, they're there and they're connected. It's how do we discern whether we've got these right or wrong? And I find that really fascinating.
Discernment. Yeah, I'm with you on that one. And I just want to share my screen to show a cartoon.
Brilliant. Wonderful.
That was a newspaper about that study.
That's brilliant.
And you're right. That's for me. This speaks volumes. I don't know who the cartoonist was who drew that, but it just sum it all up.
I love it, and I just love that that's part of the koshas. That to me is really intriguing. This ancient technology, an ancient seeking to understand how we work, and here we are these days suddenly having neuroscientists say, oh, actually you need to discern that relationship, and gut instincts aren't always right. Well, and here it turns out they knew. I like that.
And where can people find out more about your work?
I have a website, Interception Yoga, and I'm often on Instagram or Facebook at Interception Yoga.
Brilliant. Thank you so much, Laura. It's been
lovely to meet you.
A pleasure and a surprise. I didn't expect to be talking so much about politics, but it's almost like been a question that's been brewing, or not necessarily just in politics, but in business and decision making, how interoceptive awareness may be a useful tool. So I've really enjoyed our conversation. Thank you so much.
Oh, it was lovely. It was lovely to talk to you. Really nice. And I've enjoyed finding out more about your work as well. It's just like there's little pockets of people all over the place who are interested in these things. Nice to have the connections.